Okay, the title of this session is Hyper-globalization is Dead, What Will Replace It? Just a quick note about terminology, of course. We didn't mean that globalization is dead, but I think there's a particular narrative and a particular system of globalization that seems to be really behind us. And that was a set of ideas about how ever deeply integrated financial markets and ever more extensive trade agreements would drive global prosperity. And even if not immediately, certainly in the medium run would lift all boats. And I think that kind of understanding of a globalization, I think, seems to be very much behind us. I think that understanding has been killed by a number of different things. Probably the most important thing might be geopolitics, the US-China competition, and how a kind of a much more zero-sum understanding of the world economy has come to dominate thinking in the United States, to a much lesser extent also in Europe. I think it's been killed by greater appreciation of the climate transition challenge, which actually has pushed a lot of countries and regions to move in a much more unilateral way, doing things that often violate the letter and more often violate the spirit of the kind of WTO multilateral understanding of the trade regime. I think it's been killed by sort of distributive struggles within advanced countries as a result of a kind of a backlash to the regional and labor market inequalities that the sort of post-1990 global economic order created. So this is where we are. We are at a point where sort of our post-1990 understanding of how we erect a global economic order and what we should be doing, I think that consensus has dissipated. It's not at all clear what's going to come out of it, and that's what our panel is going to help us think about. What's the next stage, and how can we move in a way that actually sort of the intended or unintended spillovers to the rest of the world, in particular low-income countries, can also be avoided. I think we have can't imagine sort of having three more interesting and innovative thinkers on these issues. And since I assembled this panel, I asked the people whose ideas and thinking I value the most on these kinds of issues. So we'll get started with Jayati Ghosh, who's professor at UMass Amherst, followed by Henry Farrell at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and then Michael Clemens, who just moved to George Mason. To the extent possible, I'm going to try to do this in a conversational way, although I haven't been entirely successful at dissuading my participants from using slides. So we'll get started with Jayati.
Thank you so much, Dani. In fact, yes, Dani specifically asked us not to use slides, so of course I made some. But only because I want to show you some pictures. How do I move them? Yes, okay. Can't move this one, all right. Yeah, so just to give you a sense about where we are in terms of what's happening. And this is the global trade to global GDP ratio. And it's fairly clear that yes, after 2008, in fact, 2008 is the turning point. So really before the crisis really hit, you get this decline, stagnation of global trade to GDP. But hey, it's still significantly larger than it was in the early 90s. It is around 55% in the average of the last 2-3 years, which is about 150% of what it was in the early 90s. So it's still globalized, not hyper-globalized, absolutely, as Dani said. And of course, one of the big changes of this whole period was this huge sort of supply chain integration, as it's been called. And the thing that everyone's talking about, the end of globalization or hyper-globalization, is also very much reflecting the disintegration of global production, which is the result of the trade wars, the pandemic, all of the things Dani mentioned, the military wars, the geopolitical tensions, and this new tendency to sort of industrial policy that we talked about yesterday. But also there is a changing role of financial flows. And that's worth bearing in mind. So these are graphs which are due to Hyung-Sung Shin of the Bank for International Settlements. This is really looking at the balance sheet data of companies across countries and across sectors. So Feb 2020, that's the left side, which is, have I shown you the wrong one already? Is this countries or companies? I can't see it myself. This is across countries, okay. Yeah, so sorry, this is companies across countries, which is showing you the degree of integration. And one of the things you see is that in that 2-year period, you actually get a significant change in terms of the links that companies themselves have with other companies, in terms of the supply links that they're creating across countries. And if you look at it sector-wise, has it moved? Yes, it has. Okay, great, thank you. Takes longer to move on mine, so. Yeah, if you look at it sector-wise, then you get, in fact, a similar position of significant, oh, okay, never mind. I'm just gonna stand here. Can I stand here so I can see it? Yeah, if you look at it sector-wise, you actually get not as much of a shift, but nonetheless a shift. So what you're really getting is changes in supply chains which are reflecting the trade globalization. Remember that in the period that Dani mentioned as hyper-globalization, about 85% of trade is intermediate products. It's really the supply chain which is making the big changes. Now, this is also important because it's been argued, in fact, Shin argues precisely this, that it's the supply chain. Oh, I'm sorry, I really just can't see this. Yeah, it's that the reason all this happens is because supply chains themselves are very finance intensive. They need working capital all the time. And so if you get tighter credit, if you get impacts on the access to working capital or the cost of working capital, it's going to affect supply chains. And of course, he further argues that the strong dollar has actually made things worse. So contrary to the earlier ideas where if your currency depreciates relative to the dollar, you're more competitive, in fact, you're less competitive as a result. I would argue that yes, this is important, but it's only one of the reasons for global trade fragmentation. So, this decline that you see, this is the the cross-border lending of banks relative to world GDP, and it's BIS data. So you can see that that's come down, only a slight recovery in that pandemic period. But in fact, there's a lot more that's going on in trade. There's reshoring, there's shifting to regional or specific partner-oriented trade, which reflects the geopolitics rather than the more purely finance reasons. Meanwhile, of course, finance itself has changed. Cross-border financial flows are still very volatile. Financial flows. This is different from the earlier graph. These are net flows from OECD DAC countries to the rest of the world. So it's not total cross-border bank lending. This is just lending from the OECD countries to financial flows from the rest of the countries to the rest of the flows. This is net. The gross is huge. It's much, much higher, many, many multiples of the net. And the gross is the thing that creates all the problems for developing countries, because it's these gross flows that countries respond to in terms of their policies. They typically present policies, they prevent the policy space of developing countries. Okay, now Zoom has quit unexpectedly. I'm just letting the organizers know. Yeah. So, sorry about that. Essentially, once you have these large growth flows, you have a fear of capital flight. And so typically you constrain your macroeconomic policies and particularly fiscal policies. So a whole range of low and medium income countries did not spend as much during the pandemic forget as much, they really didn't spend much at all in the pandemic, even compared to what they spent after the global financial crisis. To give you one very stark indicator, the US spent, I think it was between $25,000 and $30,000 per capita additional fiscal spending. Low-income countries as a group spent $2 additional per capita between January 2021 and Feb 2022. So significant difference. Okay. Yeah, the other problem with financial integration, yeah. Oh, thank you. Because then I can't see it, but never mind. The other problem with financial integration is that it's hugely costly for the countries that have actually engaged in it. So this is looking at 4 Asian countries, Thailand, India, Malaysia, and Korea. And what you get is that there is a huge difference between the returns you get on your investments abroad compared to what foreigners get in investing in your own country, the seigniorage costs, if you like. And these seigniorage costs over this extended period have been huge. They have been as much as 6.5% of GDP for Thailand, more than all net inflows put together, just the seigniorage costs of being integrated into global capital markets. And so, yes, it's expensive. But in addition, you're actually affected by all kinds of global changes. Not only are you paying a lot for the privilege of trying to attract capital, but in fact, you end up being affected by things that are not of your own making. Macroeconomic policies in advanced economies being the typical example. And so there's a massive potential for volatility and crises, and especially external debt crises. And I've already mentioned how this whole desire to attract finance means that you don't do all kinds of other things. You don't do the taxation that we talked about yesterday. You don't do fiscal expansion and so on. So basically, what I'm suggesting is that this period wasn't so great for developing countries, including the so-called success stories. The ones I mentioned, the previous Asian 4 countries, they're all success stories of globalization. We know that, therefore, this globalization has really constrained autonomous industrialization and development. So, yeah, loosening of these rules is a good thing. And particularly the rule I have mentioned, but which is huge, is the stranglehold of intellectual property rights and a patent regime that dramatically reduces access to technologies. What still needs to happen is a much greater deglobalization of finance. A little bit has started because of the US sanctions. I never thought I would see that the Biden administration undoing US hegemony in the monetary world, but that seems to be what's happening. But nonetheless, there's far too much control of cross-border finance. But essentially, these periods of global churning, if you go back as far back as the 1890s, the 1920s and 30s, the 1970s, these are also periods when there have been development spurts in particular regions and countries. So it may not be a bad thing for a range of countries that could actually take advantage of the chaos and the mix-up. The problem is we have global challenges. We have obviously climate change. We have potentially many more pandemics. We have a whole bunch of other things. And so clearly you still need multilateral solutions. And the trouble is that our multilateralism is still catering to a world of 70, 80 years ago. We need to have a multilateralism that recognizes, in a way, a less globalized world, but also more fragmented with newer players on the block. Thanks.
Okay, so apologies for the mask. I just discovered I had a close exposure, so I want to be careful. And also, I did have precisely 2 slides, but I can't find them. And since I don't want to make Dani sad, I will proceed without them. So what I want to do is to give you a quick sense of 3 things. First of all, what I think hyperglobalization was. Second, why it died, or at least one important part of the story as to why it has died. And finally, to talk a little bit about how economists like the ones in this room who are interested in inclusive prosperity, what kinds of things you should be doing, according to me, in the new world. So hyperglobalization, I think the best way to think of it, or at least for me and my co-author Abraham Newman, all ideas here are down to him too, the most convenient way to think about it is as a political project, and particularly as a political project to turn the world economy into something like a globally integrated market with all of the efficiencies and wonders that you associate with sort of a properly functioning competitive market. So if you want the kind of the highfalutin version of this, you can think of this as being an effort to turn Adam Smith's wealth of nations into the wealth of the world. If you want the somewhat vulgarized version, you can turn to a multitude of business bestsellers perpetrated by Thomas Friedman and his ilk, which give you a very, very crude and simplified version of that story. And it's a very important story. And it really changed the world in the period, I think, from the 1990s through to 4 or 5 years ago. But obviously, it has begun to fall apart. The first slide, which I was going to show you, with basically 2 snapshots I took of the Financial Times global economy page this morning. Both of them showing all of these stories about China and US confrontation, about the difficulties of sanctions in Russia, suggesting that I think that this is a world which has fundamentally changed. You would not have expected to see these stories 5 or 6 years ago. Now they are dominating the front pages of the Bibles of globalization, the FT, the Economist, the Wall Street Journal. All of these, sort of story after story in the international economy is about geopolitics and how geopolitics is gobbling up the hyper-globalization project. So how did this happen? Well, I would say Abe and I have a book forthcoming in September, which you should be pre-ordering not only for yourselves, but your students right at this moment. Yes, I am obliged to say this contractually. And I think our story, which I think is a reasonable story, is pretty straightforward. That this, in effect, the death of hyperglobalization was an emergent property of the phenomenon itself. And so I'm very grateful to have been able to go after Jayati, because she gave these fantastic graphs showing us the complexity of the global economy. And beneath all of that are a set of rather boring seeming technical networks that people have not paid all that much attention to. So we have on the one hand, financial networks, which enable capital to get from point A to point B, things like dollar clearing, like on the SWIFT messaging network. We have also, of course, the production network, supply chains, value chains, call them what you will, which Jayati was describing in her presentation. And finally, we also have information networks such as the internet, which play an incredibly important role. You do not get the kinds of advanced production models in which Apple is able to coordinate with hundreds of different subcontractors if you do not have some very, very efficient system for getting information from one place to another in a reliable fashion. So these networks, these were the backbone of globalization. And it turns out that these networks turn out to have some interesting properties. They get increasingly asymmetric over time. That is, some nodes in the network are far more important than others. And the key parts of the network, partly because it is a period of US dominance and hegemony, tend to be in places where the United States has jurisdiction or effective control of one sort or another. So around a decade after this really begins to get going, the new age of hyperglobalization, a second set of changes begin to take place, which people pay far less attention to. After September 11, 2001, the United States looks at the system that it has helped bring into being, helped to foster this global financial system, this global information system, realizes that there are big threats out there which are in part being enabled by these systems, and then begins to start to think about ways in which it can use its control of central elements of these systems for information and for coercion. And so you get the industrial scale coercion, which people like Edward Snowden revealed happening some years later. You also get the United States beginning to figure out how to use dollar clearing and SWIFT, for example, to cut entire countries, adversary countries, out of the global financial system. If it has control of the choke points of the key nodes in the network, it is effectively capable of using this to exercise much greater influence. This doesn't get nearly as much notice as it deserves until 2016 or so. The Trump administration, sort of in its crudity, helps to make it clear what is happening. We see a lot of other countries suddenly beginning to wake up and pay attention, in particular powers such as the European Union and China, a variety of countries in the developing world, and they all start to think about ways in which they can either insulate themselves or fight back, and we end up in the world that we are in today. And this is a very interesting world because it is not the world of the Cold War. The world of the Cold War was one where there was a massive nuclear confrontation between two powers who were nonetheless quite distinct economically. You had trade in grain, some other commodities, sort of gas, most of them sort of problematically, but you did not have all that much in the way of direct economic contact between the two. Now we have a world of somewhat more muted confrontation, but combined with massive interdependence. So we're getting the geopolitics and the interdependence happening on top of each other all at once. And this is the world that hyperglobalization has bred. This is the world that we are forced to deal with and forced to confront and forced to think through how exactly we can sort of better and sort of mitigate many of the problems, many of the risks that arise. Increased confrontation between China and the US being one very, very important source of potential future difficulties. So this, I think, poses some important challenges, and in particular, it poses some important challenges to economists. And what I want to do here to illustrate this is I want to take something that Dani said yesterday in the fantastic panel with Erica and Pierre, and to turn it around. Because what Dani presented to Erica and Pierre, he presented a standard economist's argument, which I know he doesn't necessarily subscribe to himself, a standard sort of Chicago economic critique, which is more or less, if you're to do industrial policy, if you're to make these big interventions in the economy, what gives you the knowledge to be able to do it right? And the standard account, of course, from Chicago economists has been sort of based on the assumption that states have limited information and that markets know best, that it is far, far better to hand over the actual governance of all of this stuff to markets and to market actors. We now live in a world where that has suddenly become vastly more complicated. If we're not just talking about the benefits of markets in terms of efficiency, or Hayekian or Schumpeterian stories about how so you get these diffuse processes of innovation being enabled by markets, we're also talking about national security being fundamentally intertwined with market processes. These are the kinds of things that sort of markets don't do particularly well. There's a reason why Adam Smith sort of basically says, so that certain functions such as defense need to be arrogated to the state. And when defense and the sort of economy become imbricated with each other, as they do in this kind of interdependent world that we are in, we cannot just trust to market knowledge to try and figure things out. But the problem is, of course, that we have been trusting to market knowledge for the last 40 or 50 years. And one of, I think, the challenges that faces the economics profession, and indeed the social sciences more generally, is that we do not have the appropriate forms of knowledge to figure out state-market interactions in a world where security and market operations are so deeply intertwined in many areas that it is absolutely impossible to separate them. When we're trying to figure out, for example, what kinds of processes of innovation, technological innovation we want, where we want them to happen, what kinds of networks we want to connect our economies together, we cannot just think in terms of efficiency and innovation anymore. We have to think about security too. And on the one hand, I think economists do not do a particularly good job at that, to be perfectly frank. On the other hand, to be equally frank, I think political scientists like myself are only beginning to understand ourselves what to do. So one of the things I would love to see coming from this this meeting and other meetings like it is working together in the ways that Erica suggested to try and bring together economists, political scientists, other social scientists, material sciences and engineering people, network people, data science, trying to figure out what kind of knowledge can we provide both to states and to some extent to market actors as well, to help them navigate this new and complex set of trade-offs, which really do not fall within the bailiwick of any individual discipline. I think we need to generate cross-disciplinary knowledge. My second slide was one of those sort of fancy things that you can click on, and it'll bring you to a URL, which has an article that Abe Newman and I wrote calling for this kind of integration. If you want to find it, it is, I think it's, what is it called again? Something like sort of networks, sort of financial networks can be easily weaponized. It appeared in Nature last year, and it just sort of lays out some of the things that that I've just talked about. Thank you very much.
I'll just say if that's okay. Do I have to turn this on? Thank you. It's great to be here with all of you. I think of this meeting as historic. So last year, fiscal 2022, desperate migrants traveled all the way to the US southwest border and were apprehended there by the US government. Without authorization from any government, they traveled and were apprehended 2,379,000 times. So when all of you were planning this conference years ago, before the pandemic started, the number of people apprehended at the border in a year is now routinely apprehended in a period of 6 weeks. Right now I lead a strange double life. On one hand, I'm a tenured professor in an economics department and a fellow at the Peterson Institute. And at some hours of the week, I'm a part of the US administration. I advise the administration on basically what to do about that migration pressure. Awkwardly, I'm legally obliged to say every time I mention that I'm obviously speaking here only as a university professor and not as a representative of anyone in the administration. It means that when I'm not revising and resubmitting, I'm getting calls, including once at 10:30 p.m. on a Saturday, whose message is basically, what should we do? And I thought that situation was a useful lens through which to ask the two questions that Dani posed to me about this panel on hyperglobalization, in the aspect of migration specifically, which are what is the promise of labor mobility and what are we actually headed for instead? So to take the first one about the promise of labor mobility, the promise of labor mobility is inclusive prosperity. It is economic mobility. International migration remains by far the most effective single systematic route to economic mobility for the world's poor in most places, most of the time. To take one of a million examples that you could cite, a Guatemalan laborer who comes to work temporarily in the United States as an H-2B forestry worker multiplies their wages by 12 at purchasing power parity. And in the groundbreaking work of Chetty and Hendren and collaborators looking at the effect of neighborhoods or universities on economic mobility, you're not going to find systematic effects like that, and I doubt that you ever will. So that's an incredible power. The promise of labor mobility is a vast opportunity for exchange globally between young people and old people. Workers are disappearing from the advanced economies. Fertility in Germany is far below replacement at 1.6. In China, it's 1.3. In Korea, it's 0.78. Meanwhile, in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa alone, the net growth in working age population of sub-Saharan Africa from now till 2050 is projected with reliable accuracy to be 750 million people. I just want to repeat that. This is the net increment to the working age population of just sub-Saharan Africa is larger than the entire current labor force of all high-income OECD countries put together. And there are many ways to interpret that. I interpret it as a vast opportunity for mutually beneficial exchange between places where workers are going to be needed and places where workers are. Finally, the promise of labor mobility is to capitalize on one of the best things that's ever happened in human history, which is the astonishing success of economic development over the last couple of generations. Why are all of those Africans going to be aging into the labor force? Many reasons, but if you had to pick a single fundamental reason, it's that they didn't die as children, and that's why they're still around. That youth bulge is part and parcel of the demographic transition, which is usually part and parcel of the development process. It is a sign of development success. The same thing in Central America. Why is the emigration rate of Northern Central America per capita 4 times Mexico? Many reasons, but a really big one is the fact that it is an aftershock of the collapse of child mortality in Northern Central America, which happened a few decades after it happened in Mexico. So what's happening now in Central America could be interpreted as a rightward shifted bulge of what happened in Mexico-US migration in the 1980s and 1990s. Again, a symptom of economic success, a symptom of successful development, and a big opportunity. Maybe one of the biggest challenges in all of development, according to Nigerian Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, and I would agree, is finding jobs for those people. And young migrants now and in the future are building inclusive prosperity for themselves in that act where others have failed to do it for them at home. So that's the promise. Dani asked me very poignantly, what are we headed for instead? And as always, in every question I've ever encountered in international political economy, the best way to start thinking about it is to read Dani Rodrik. And in almost 30 years ago, Dani predicted the trilemma of the global economy, or the trilemma of globalization, which probably nearly all of you know better than I, but I'll just rehearse it. It's the powerful conceptual framework that countries' stance towards international exchange tends to vary in 3 dimensions of hyper-globalization, sovereignty, and democracy, and that in the broadest terms, the trade-offs between these things are such that countries can choose 2 of these things and not all 3. And in migration, for example, what that means is, as Milton Friedman pointed out long ago, that there's a tension between a sovereign democratic nation's ability to build a welfare state and open borders. And there are many other examples of that. And this is not a conjecture, it became true. Since Dani wrote, the foreign-born fraction of the US is up to over 14%, which is essentially at its all-time high of a century ago. And unlike a century ago, 88% of that foreign-born is people from Asia, Latin America, and increasingly Africa, not from Europe. And I think a useful way to interpret events of the last several years is Dani's framework. And I'm certainly not at all the first person to say this. The previous US administration erased successfully 86% of refugee arrivals in the United States. It explicitly adopted a policy of ethnic nationalism in building a set of policies whose indisputably explicit goal was to restrict the Muslim population of the United States. And I think those policies could be very usefully interpreted as a reaction to take back sovereignty that had been perceived to be taken by hyperglobalization. The previous administration, the previous regime has engaged in a series of attacks on the electoral system, on the Congress, and now on the judiciary, attacks that continue this morning. And I think a useful way to interpret those is as a reaction to seize back power from people perceiving the democratic system to not be delivering to them the power that they feel they deserve. So the answer, so my pessimistic answer to Dani's second question is, what can we expect? What are we headed for? We're certainly headed for more of those frightening things. But I want to conclude with a descriptive and a normative claim, which is that it doesn't have to be that way. We don't need to just accept those frightening consequences as the just desserts of hyper-globalists like Michael Clemens. There are institutional innovations we can build to actually alter the trade-offs at the three vertices of Dani's triangle. Those are the institutions I'm trying to work with the US government to build, and later in the panel we could talk about what those are.
Thank you. While all of you think of questions and comments, I do want to follow up with the panelists on a couple of issues. I'll ask something to Jayati and Harry in a second, but I want to first follow up immediately on the comments that Michael made. There's been interesting, of course, difference, and that's been implicit in our discussion, but we haven't said it explicitly, that under hyperglobalization, we pushed very hard on integrating markets and goods and finance. But of course, the market that we did the worst in integrating were labor markets. And the reason that sort of makes a difference, I think, and I think the sense in which the trilemma you mentioned bites a little bit less in principle with respect to labor markets, is that, I mean, the standard principle of public finance that the efficiency cost of a tax rises with the square of the tax rate. So when the barriers in international finance and international goods markets are already very, very low, the efficiency gains that you get from further lowering those barriers are very low. In fact, those tend to be mostly redistribute income to, financial entities, corporations, multinationals, and then are sort of a lot of losses that are suffered and the net efficiency gone. I mean, that's what standard trade theory would say. Of course, what's different in the international labor markets is that the barriers are so high. So in fact, the efficiency gains are huge from even marginal reductions in those barriers at the border. I think that matters for the possibility of institutional innovation, because there is so much that you can redistribute. So if the net gains are very large, it should be incumbent on economists to think about institutional arrangements whereby you can actually do a good job of redistributing those gains and alleviating what is in principle a tension between international equality, which is opening up your borders up to low-income workers from the rest of the world, and domestic equality, which is what would happen to low-wage workers in your own economy if you did that. So you mentioned, so the follow-up question is, what are those institutional innovations? What are sort of some of those policies that could alleviate those trade-offs?
Yes, thank you. You can hear me. Maybe I'll be really brief, because each of these could be the whole afternoon, and I want also to leave time for the panel. One of them is increasing bilateral regulation of temporary labor mobility, and each of those aspects of bilateral regulation could reasonably be seen as a cession of sovereignty. Right now, the US runs its temporary employment visa program entirely unilaterally. At other times in history, and other countries in the world do it quite differently. Temporary workers also, if they lack a path to citizenship, are inherently being limited in their own democratic expression and their own entitlements to redistribution and social safety nets and these things. I would point out, even though both of those things are true, that better institutions can alter the trade-off. Not to deny that the trade-off exists, but to alter the trade-off. Specifically in the case of bilateral regulation, one of the biggest reasons why the US temporary visa system is so fraught with abuse of workers' rights is the fact that US laws intended to prevent those abuses cannot be enforced in the countries of origin. And things like large illegal fees being charged to migrants, if they're not being enforced in Guatemala or in Mexico by those governments as part of a quid pro quo seen to be in those governments' interests, can't be enforced by the United States and are just going to happen. So here is a way that a cession of sovereignty actually enhances the ability of the United States to maintain the rule of law and enforce its own laws and establish its sovereign interest. So what might look on the surface like a cession of sovereignty actually enhances sovereignty. The second is a greater reliance on labor migration pathways to complement humanitarian pathways. A really striking feature to me of the biggest three recent migrant crises in the world, millions of Venezuelans pouring out of Venezuela, millions of Syrians in Turkey, millions of Ukrainians in Western Europe, is that none of them are being regulated by the three traditional channels for regulating migration: family visas, employment visas, and humanitarian visas. None of those are being used. All three of them are being primarily regulated by ad hoc, non-deportation, temporary protected status, not granting refugee status to any of those people. As you know, in Turkey, the government carefully refers to Syrians as misafir, guest, and not mülteci, refugee. Why? Because giving somebody refugee status gives up sovereignty. You can't kick them out anymore. You have promised non-refoulement in the Geneva Convention, and once you do that, that cession of sovereignty has proved to be too much for many of the destination countries. And in practice, they're coming up with ad hoc solutions that allow a right to work much better, far superior for those to be regulated in ways that are transparent and that voters feel like they have some sort of control over, rather than ad hoc temporary protected status cooked up in the moment and becomes quite controversial and may not last. And the third and final one, because I'm taking too much time, are national institutions that allow response to changing pressures for migration overseas. The United States doesn't have any. Joe Biden came to office, and a month later, he issued an executive order for his administration to issue more visas to Central Americans, specifically as a way to reduce pressure from irregular migration at the border. Problem: there's literally no one in the US government whose job it is to issue visas to a targeted region. The main visa that all of them could qualify for, the temporary guest work visa, is entirely in the hands of employers. If there's no US employer who demands labor from Honduras, Joe Biden cannot issue a single temporary guest work visa to Honduras, and there's no office of the government that is empowered to target the issuance of visas to a particular place based on pressures from that place. Three different forms of missing institutions, three ways to change the trade-offs at the vertices.
Great, that's great. I want to ask Henry and Jayati about your views about the future and how we can make maybe a better scenario more possible. Very crudely, as I see it, we have two paths in terms of where we're going with globalization. Sort of, the good scenario is where we sort of return to some version of the Bretton Woods regime. I don't mean fixed exchange rates, but I mean a system where a much thinner set of global rules, where advanced countries would focus mostly on their sort of domestic problems of building more cohesive societies, more equity, focusing more on climate change through domestic policy instruments, and the rest of the world, developing countries, would have pretty much of a free ride in terms of what kind of policies, what kind of economic strategies they want to pursue, much less constrained by international rules. The ugly scenario, or the bad scenario, is sort of a kind of a world in which geopolitics runs the world, and sort of having taken the keys of the world economy from financial institutions and multinational corporations, we hand them to the national security establishments of major powers. And what we get a kind of a system where existing levels of economic interdependence are weaponized, using Henry, your and Abe's term. Increasingly, the rest of the world is being asked to take sides, whether you're on the US side or on the China side. And the gains in trade, in which we all believe in, are more and more extinguished by this sort of zero-sum conception. How do we get the better one? Is that, have I drawn this more or less appropriately? Who wants it? Henry?
Okay, so I think that we're going to get a mixture. If I were to guess, I would say we're going to get a mixture with much more of the bad stuff than the good stuff, which is to say that it's pretty clear that security and the focus on national security has increased to some degree the space for policy innovation at the national level. There's a lot of stuff that can happen today that could not have happened 4 to 6 to 8 years ago. And some of that is thanks to security concerns. You know, if you look at the story of semiconductors, this is clearly a story about worries about TSMC, and the choke point in Taiwan is a big part of the reason why we are seeing all of these people suddenly looking to try and create semiconductors of the, semiconductor manufacturing capacities at home, so that there is some degree of robustness against unexpected geopolitical shocks. But I think that the other side of this, the likelihood of tensions and spirals, is very, very high. And I think that so this is partly because if we're thinking about topics such as innovation, they're inherently difficult to it's hard to predict what the future is going to hold, as Hayek, in fairness to him, said. And so so if you're in a world where that suddenly becomes a source of security concerns, people naturally tend to go towards the sort of worst beliefs rather than sort of about what is going to happen, rather than the best beliefs. And we get the same kinds of spirals that happened sort of during the Cold War with respect to the sort of missile gap fears being turned into sort of fears about the economy. We get actions such as the United States denial of high-end semiconductors to China, obviously being perceived by China as being a direct attack, not just on the sort of areas of national security, which the US is worried about, but on China's capacity to try and actually have any independent degree to set its own economic and political destiny at all. And so I worry that we're going to, it's far, far easier to see the downside stuff taking hold than it is to see the upside stuff taking hold. This is one of the reasons why I think we need to have a lot more in the way of actual developed, clear knowledge. It's very, very clear. I'm sort of, anybody who goes to DC, the United States, it looks like a massive monolithic powerhouse from the outside. Inside, it's some sort of 5 or 10 people in any particular area running around desperately trying to figure out what the hell to do. And they don't necessarily have the knowledge or the background to provide that. We as academics need to, I think, re-gear ourselves towards trying to do this. And then, and this gets to some of what Jayati said right at the end of her presentation, we also need to rethink global institutions. It's clear that WTO type institutions are not fit for purpose anymore. We need institutions where we can actually start to think more systematically about the balance between security and economics. And to get to those institutions, we need to have dialogue happening informally between the United States and China and other powers, in the same way as we had between the United States and Soviet Union during the worst periods of the Cold War, to at least try to figure out if there are common frameworks of understanding.
Right. So we'll open it up for questions for a few minutes if you have any questions after Jayati's remarks.
Yeah, very quickly, I have a slightly different take. I think geopolitics was already ruling the world before the Ukraine war. I mean, if you look at what happened during the pandemic and the combination of vaccine grab and lack of resources available to the rest of the world outside G7, and the prevention of any TRIPS waiver in the WTO. And I think G7 actually doesn't realize the extent to which this has really, really alienated large populations everywhere else. So the relative failure of the Western world to line up allies in the Ukraine war is not just realpolitik in the immediate. It's comes from a deep sense of, let's be honest, disgust at the behavior, and the sense that there's this deep nationalism where we're not going to bother about you when it comes to anything, but you have to line up behind us whenever we ask. So I also, I would say that, I don't think it was the case that the previous, the period of hyperglobalization, you've written about it more than anybody else, Dani, it was not particularly great for most developing countries, right? It was not one where most of the people at least benefited in terms of better employment, etc. If you take China out, in fact, the average wages did not increase, average employment rates did not increase, and so on. So I think it's a more complex picture. In that case, then what can we expect? And I think in a peculiar way, I wouldn't be more, it's dire, there's no question about it, because as I said, we're facing all these global challenges and we don't have the global institutions that can help resolve it. On the other hand, is it all doomed because of geopolitics? I'm not so sure, because I think the geopolitics existed already. Yes, they're more severe. There are more points of conflagration. There are more people dying, not in Europe, I would add. Yemen has got many more deaths and much more violent deaths fed by American arms than Ukraine. But there are all these flashpoints for sure. But at the same time, these periods of instability do allow for a little bit more experimentation than was available in the last 20 years. And I'm not sure that that's always a bad thing, because policy experimentation in many different ways, including in the pursuit of knowledge, which has been heavily restricted and monopolized, I think all of those would make a difference. And, you mentioned SWIFT. The fact that SWIFT can no longer be trusted, I don't think people realize how huge that is. SWIFT was a bit like container technology for globalization. It was the financial equivalent of container technology. It enabled massive integrations. Suddenly you're saying, well, wait a minute, if we don't like you, we're going to cut off your access. Everyone else in the world is thinking about this and saying, well, we have to build up alternative systems. And they're doing that, in fact. We're going to see the results of that in a few years. So we're going to get different kinds of things emerge. I'm not so sure that all of them are necessarily bad. Yes, that's less US power, but US power hasn't always been a force for the good. And the big challenge I do see, though, is the fact that we still are unable to deal with the huge global challenges. And I think that's the big one. So I don't know what we do about that.
Okay. Anat?
Yeah, so I just wanted to bring up something else that's related to global relations. We do have a violent war now, which we somehow thought was not possible. But I want to bring up other kinds of wars that we might, as economists, sort of, think are they're lurking. And that's cyber attacks and cyber weapons in general. So if you read the book like This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends, about those markets in zero hacks and all of that, and all of a sudden you realize that, we're not in the space of tanks and nuclear bombs, but in the space of somebody in some basement, being able to sell some hacking of infrastructure. It's scary proposition. So the question is the world, ready to, are nations of this world ready to negotiate any kind of agreement on any of these things, or are we just really vulnerable to these kind of invisible weaponry that because our lives depend so much on digital technology these days, and it's so hackable. Our infrastructure is so hackable, and the U.S. is partly responsible for this because we thought we were so good at surveillance, but then we showed all the hackers what can be done, and so the weaponry moved to the private sector. So that's a challenge.
Henry, you've written on this.
Okay, yeah, it's a very interesting. So one thing I would say is that we have actually seen less than we expected in the context of the Ukraine war. It is the dog that didn't bark. That is not to say that there have not been attempted hacks of the energy system. Microsoft has some interesting reports about stuff that got repelled, but we have not seen the kind of large-scale breakdown that we would have expected to see, or large-scale attacks. Most of the attacks on Ukraine's energy grid have been physical, kinetic attacks. We've seen much less, and I don't have a good story as to what has happened. I suspect that this is a mixture of some of the stuff not working as well as it might be expected, and some of it is also perhaps an implicit deterrence. Russia is extremely vulnerable to these kinds of attacks, and if it starts getting engaged in this war, so this is one of those wars in which there is a possibility that asymmetric, that this is one of these wars in which it's possible that a weaker opponent can have an asymmetrically outsized sort of ability to hurt the other actor. So it may be that it is in Russia's best interest. That said, I think that the broader phenomena that you point to, markets for zero-day exploits and so on, they play an important role. Of course, a lot of the markets, and this is something I know people are trying to work on, it's really hard to see what's happening because the key markets are the ones that are completely non-public. You get these hackers fairs or whatever, where people are selling these cheapo exploits, but the real stuff is happening in private sales, very often to the United States and other great powers. One of the most interesting things that I think has happened recently is the United States beginning to start using its sanctions capacity, this this financial power, to start to try and go after some of the more irresponsible businesses that have been selling these sort of automated toolkits to authoritarian regimes. That suggests that the US is beginning to rebalance to some degree its understanding of the benefits and disadvantages of regulation. Of course, it is doing this unilaterally. I still think we are not going to see any plausible treaties happening here anytime soon, and in part because the United States, China, Russia have very different understandings. The United States talks about cybersecurity, which it sees as being very technical. Russia and China talk about information security. They basically don't want sort of forms of information which might destabilize their regime. And it's very hard to see how there is going to be any kind of a coalescence around these principles, even though the US is now more worried about information attacks destabilizing democracies than it would have been 5 or 6 years back.
Any other questions or comments, Suresh?
Yeah, so I was sort of curious about, and it didn't really come up except tangentially, just kind of how we should think about the fact that, there's a real democracy, non-democracy divide in these global arrangements. And so that, if to the extent that we should consider the political systems of the trading partners, of the integration partners, as sort of a dimension of sort of the friendshoring stuff and things like this, that we we should be more friendly or not towards political democracies than non-democracies, and that's maybe a trickier normative question than you're comfortable dealing with, but it does seem to be on the table for this. And
Jayati, you want to take that?
Wow. Okay, if you go back half a century, say, I mean, the US was quite comfortable dealing with non-democracies, right? In fact, it made lots of countries non-democracies. I'm just saying in general. It's just such a tricky question now. What is a democracy? I mean, I don't know. Is India a democracy right now? I'm not sure. Is Turkey a democracy? So it's really complicated, right? So I'm not so sure you can draw those lines very clearly. I agree that is the stuff of a lot of the sort of media, the way it's presented, that, we are going to be dealing with democracies and we're good guys putting conditions on human rights and so on. But I don't think that's operating in practice. Oh.
My question was just even accounting for the US as a possible non-democratic, it's the point is that the policy making should still have
an ethical dimension. It should. A lot of things should happen though, right? I mean, no, I agree. No, forgetting US. I mean, I'm just saying that in terms of, let's say, global trade and finance interactions, it's hard to think of any country in the world that is actually operating along those lines. Should they be operating along those lines? It's so complicated. How do you decide when it is one? So,
I think there are some normative grounds on which I think you would want to make a distinction between democracies and non-democracies in international economic agreements, notwithstanding the issue of how you would actually judge that. I think that the argument would be that deep economic integration entails the harmonization of institutions. So two sets of labor standards, for example. That becomes deeply problematic when one of the partners is blatantly authoritarian, where you cannot prima facie argue that the labor standards are a result of a democratic choice by that country. So you can allow for diversity, but then the diversity of these labor market arrangements at least have to be the choice of some process of deliberation, democratic choice. So when one partner is not a democracy, that sort of prima facie presumption is lost. I think that would generate a kind of a normative case where a rebuttable presumption that deep integration is something to be looked at much more carefully when there are sort of some of the partners are at least authoritarian. We're over time. Is it a very quick question, John?
So the question is really to the panel about the rate and pace at which you think the world will deglobalize. And the reason I bring it up is I'm not a traditional academic. I ran AT&T's international operations and had to deal with some of these issues at a broad scale. But if you look at Henry's example of semiconductors, if you think about ASML, which controls the lithography market, they have a supply chain. A machine has 4,000 units in it, and they have a supply chain that covers a huge number of companies from different countries that play into it. They control the lithography market. You look at TSMC, and then 90% of memory chips, high-end memory chips, right? And so they're going to have a very complicated supply chain. And these supply chains can't be disaggregated or decoupled quickly or easily. And if you look at the embedded base, $1 trillion to produce a 9-nanometer semiconductor chip, $50 billion is a lot out of the CHIPS Act, but it's nothing compared to the trillion. So what do you think? I think these things are very hard to decouple. And what are the forces that push against decoupling versus towards decoupling? And the analogy somebody gave me, even with China, was if you think of China, last thing, Dani, as a rowboat with, you got two people in the rowboat, they don't particularly like one another, they're on a turbulent ocean, and if they don't figure out how to row together, they're going to crash on the rocks. And that's a strong force to figure out how to cooperate, even if you don't really want to. So.
Who wants to take this?
Well, very quickly, yeah, I think that's true. I think there is a real evidence that the kinds of integration that you have at the moment, you can't just sort of say, okay, tomorrow we're going to stop. And countries that have attempted, in India, for example, we're hugely dependent on China for bulk drugs. 95% of our bulk drugs come from China. We're having effectively a border war with them right now, but we're still importing the bulk drugs. We can't. So I think, there is this tension, and in a way, that's a good thing. As you say, a kind of possibly a force for good by accident, if it actually does work, if you don't get, maniacs in power who are too busy to think about that immediate interest, to worry about the self-destruction. So, I do think that there would be serious limits on certainly rapid deglobalization.
Very quickly, I think that there's going to be a lot of variation across sectors. And I think that TSMC, I think, is in a particular, and ASML in a somewhat different way, they're in a particularly hard place when it comes to this. In that, on the one hand, as you say, you're a company, you're looking at this, so geopolitical risk is just one of the issues you're considering. You're also considering reliability of suppliers, long-term relations where you know what they're going to do, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also been very clear that as TSMC has dealt with, for example, the restrictions on Huawei, and then the more recent sort of restrictions and the extension of the so-called foreign direct product rule, which really makes it extremely hard for companies like TSMC to operate outside of the US thing. When the US says jump, they jump. And so I think that we're going to see, especially in areas such as semiconductors, which are highly politically sensitive, we're going to see companies like TSMC having to make difficult decisions. There was I'll bag on Thomas Friedman another time. He wrote a terrible op-ed back in 2020, more or less saying, well, China, you just look at Taiwan and you look at TSMC. If you invade, you're going to hurt yourself and whatever, and you'll be stupid. It's one of his Chairman Z, this is what you do kind of op-eds. And 2 weeks after that, Morris Chang, the founder of TSMC, is at a conference, and he doesn't respond directly, but he says in politely withering sarcasm, well, Tom, we're not living in sort of a flat world anymore. And I think that is sort of basically where we are. TSMC is being forced to take geopolitics into consideration, and also is being forced to take into account the ways in which Gelsinger and Intel are trying to use geopolitics in order to undermine some of TSMC's core market advantages.
And with that, we have to close. Thank you very much, our panelists.